Okay, guys. First time I've done a video in a little while. You can hear that I'm a little bit croaky, and one of my housemates is going to bed, so I need to be a little bit less exuberant than usual. Um, I've got a few questions about the coursework that seem to be coming through from a few students. Um, so I'm just going to do up a quick sort of troubleshooting video that looks at two questions on the effectiveness of the High Court in protecting rights. This is a really difficult area of study. I know a lot of it feels quite abstract. For some of you, it's the first time you've been dealing with the Constitution. You're doing a really, really fantastic job of persevering with it, and some of the answers that you're producing are really, really positive. This hard work will bear fruit in 12 months' time when you're preparing for the Year 12 exam, so absolutely stick with it. All right. I just want to draw your attention to this, cute little wordle. When we get into the Constitution, sometimes we forget what this area of study is all about. We understand this concept of human rights. Yeah, we studied it earlier in school. It's spoken a lot about in the media, that inherently you have rights. You have the right to education, which is exercised every day. You've got the right to hang out with who you want to. Yeah, this freedom of association. Whoop. It's been a while since I used this pen. Yep, you've got the freedom to support the political party that you want. You have freedom of religion, and we know that that is explicitly stated in the Constitution. Yeah. Freedom to own property. So all these things, what we're looking at is to what extent does the Constitution and those things that are in the Constitution protect our rights? Because it's not really that useful if we talk about, I've got the right to vote, if then Parliament can just take those rights away. So what we need to understand is, well, if we want to enforce our rights, how do we do it? And what can we refer to when we're doing it? So with freedom of religion, I know it's in the Constitution. So if I want to enforce my rights, I can go to the High Court, but even better, I can say, look, in the Constitution, Section 116, it gives me right to freedom of religion. To what extent do these things protect rights? How can we enforce our rights by using them? Question 2 of the coursework is a really nice 3-mark explain question. Okay, so let's go through and decode it together. Explain, make clear using multiple details. So we can't just identify different features. We have to really hit the core of this concept. Using details, the role. So what is it that they do? What is my role as a teacher? What is your role as a student? What you do? What is your role at work? Of the High Court. Immediately I can just dot a few points down. I know it's the guardian of the Constitution. Its job is to interpret the Constitution. I know that it is entrenched in Section 86. I hope someone can check that up for me, and that it can rule legislation invalid. Made by Parliament invalid. Okay, so there's a few things I know that it does in protecting rights. So how can we enforce our rights using the High Court? Using this High Court. Yeah, it's 3 marks, so I know 2 things. I've got 4.5 minutes, and I also want to have at least 3 points of detail. All right. So let's go on to using our IEEE answer scaffold. Okay, so I'm coming back to how does the High Court protect rights? What can I do if my rights are being violated, and where does the High Court get involved? Okay, so in my identify statement, I want to mention that, as I said before, the High Court is the guardian of the Constitution. And is responsible for interpreting the Constitution. It's the only court in the land that can interpret the Constitution. Okay, I want to explain this role further in depth. So I might say, as part of this role, it is able to rule, it can rule legislation made by Parliament, invalid. Okay? This means, so I take that next step and I'm going to link it back to rights. This means that if Parliament passes legislation that violates rights contained in the Constitution, it can deem those laws invalid. And the example that you can use, for example, in the Roach case, the High Court ruled the 2006 amendments to the Electoral Act invalid because they violated to too great an extent the right to vote. So that would be a really nice 3-mark answer. I'm looking at what does the High Court actually do? Why is that significant in the protection of rights? And here's an example. Again, I've got rights. If Parliament tries to take them away, what can I do? The High Court is independent of Parliament, so I can go to them if I've got standing. Let's take a step up in terms of our order of thinking. We'll go from an explain up to an evaluate. This is where we have to be a bit more critical. Okay, but I've confidently explained the role of the High Court, and now I'm ready to evaluate. Okay, I know that evaluate means strengths and weaknesses, and that's how I'm going to set up my spill the T-chart. The effectiveness. So if I've just talked about the role, how well does it do this role? How well does it achieve its purpose? Well, probably would be better to say how well does it uphold its responsibilities? What are those things that allow it to? What are those things that hold it back? Of the High Court in protecting rights, I've gone through and done that before. 6 marks. Divide 2 plus 1 equals 4 substantive big chunky points of detail, so 4 IEEs. And I'm going to have 9 minutes. But I'm not going to just jump into my answer. I'm going to set it out using my T-chart. Okay, so the first strength of the High Court in protecting rights is that the High Court is entrenched in the Constitution. The role of the High Court is expressly stated. It's explicitly stated in the words of the Constitution. Therefore, we know that the High Court can only be removed through a referendum. This is a really nice one for you to start with because you will notice that if I was evaluating express rights, I could use this strength as well. If something is written in the Constitution, we know it's incredibly hard to change, only 8 out of 44 successful referendums. Another strength is that it is independent of Parliament. This means it is doesn't have to make, politically popular decisions. It makes the right decision based on its interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, so it doesn't matter that Vicky Lee Roach was a prisoner, wasn't very popular with the Parliament at the time, and people weren't too concerned that John Howard had taken away their right to vote. The High Court interpreted the Constitution and made their ruling. One weakness, though, is that in order to bring a case, you need standing. This prevents a lot of people from bringing a case. Because in order to bring a case, I must be directly affected. Because I need standing, it discourages a lot of people, or it means that a lot of people who do have the money and the time to bring a case to try and protect the rights of others can't actually do it. Okay? Must have standing. The High Court must wait for a case to come before it. They can't just independently contact the newspaper and tell them, oh, actually, this law should be invalid. You could actually turn these into two different points if you want, 1, 2, but I like to combine them. Another weakness are the costs and time associated with undertaking action in the High Court. We saw with Vicky Lee Roach. Roach, needed the help of the Human Rights Law Centre. We'll call that a community legal centre, which it is, and may have received an adverse costs order. So if at the end of the case she'd lost, the government in the court may have applied to have their costs paid for by Roach. So she would have been in a lot of financial stress. I'm going to give you a fifth point. I'd say, nonetheless, the fact that the High Court can rule legislation invalid is an enormous strength. Because it means the moment they give their decision, if the legislation is invalid, it no longer exists. Just that particular part of the legislation. So in the Roach case, the High Court actually made the decision in August to allow people to vote. There was an election between August and September, so they wanted to make sure, okay, we give our decision the moment we give our decision, prisoners serving a sentence of 3 years or less can vote. And then they gave their reasons later in September. But from this moment on, that legislation was invalid. At each of these points, when I'm talking about the High Court, it's really easy for me to use Roach, especially point number 5, point number 4. I could use it in point number 3 as well. Only point number 2. So again, what I'm looking at is to what extent can the High Court actually protect my rights? Well, on the one hand, it is entrenched in the Constitution. It's always going to be there unless it's removed through a referendum. On the other hand, my rights would have to be directly affected in order for me to bring a case before the High Court as a result of the requirement of standing. Further, it's significantly expensive and time-consuming to take a case to the High Court. This can discourage lots of people from trying to protect their rights, and lots of ordinary people simply don't have the resources. In the Roach case, she needed the help of the Human Rights Law Centre in order to initiate a claim. Nonetheless, the High Court is independent of Parliament, so it can make decisions that may be controversial. Okay? Its role is to interpret the Constitution and make the decision accordingly. Similarly, or another strength, is that it has the ability to rule legislation invalid, and from the moment the decision is made, that legislation stops applying in the relevant jurisdiction. For example, in August 2007, etc. If you are struggling with, the role of treaties, same thing. Replace this with treaty and say, what do they actually do? Well, they set a standard. If the Australian government signs up to a treaty, it's then under an obligation to implement domestic legislation that can then protect our rights. All right. We'll keep working on this. Best of luck answering the rest of the coursework questions, and send through any other questions that you have. Keep it going.